what the Harry Potter story says is that if you're fighting a dragon, a snake, something terrible, something that will paralyze you if you look at it, and you're doing that in order to redeem something from that encounter, because you often learn things when you do something that you're afraid of. In fact, almost all learning occurs in spite of fear, right? Because to learn something, you have to explore something new, and that's usually something that's frightening. And so what that means is that if you're willing to face something that's frightening, you can garner something of value. Now, it also may well mean, in the context of that story, and you see this in the romance that underlies the first part of Harry Potter, is that, you know, the man who's capable of standing up to predatory reptiles is also the one who is most likely to attract women. And I think that that's been a truth since God only knows when, too. I mean, we have no idea. But human beings are definitely hunters, right? And men are bigger than women, and one of the things that that suggests is that, you know, a lot of the predatory-like activities that are characteristic of human beings were undertaken by males, and some usually males that hunt. But anyways, we can put all that aside. Harry gets bitten by this basilisk, and part of the reason that the story shows that is because it wants to tell you, the story wants to tell you, so to speak, that the danger that you face when you voluntarily confront something you're afraid of in order to learn is actually a danger. It's real. You see an example like that too in the Avengers. I don't remember the guy's name. He's the black guy with the patch over his eye. Who is that? Yeah. Well, you know, the representation of the one-eyed hero is also quite common, and you see this, for example, in ancient Egyptian mythology. There's a god named Horus, who I'll talk to you about. In fact, there's a picture of Horus actually. Horus is the god on the left there, on the picture of the left. He's got a face like a falcon, and that's because falcons can see. And the reason the Egyptians turned Horus into a falcon is because Horus is the eye. You've all seen the famous Egyptian eye. Horus can see. One of the things he sees is evil, and that actually, he has an encounter with evil, and as a consequence, one of his eyes gets torn out. And the idea there is that, you know, you have to face evil, just like you have to confront fear. And fear can paralyze you, and the things that make you afraid can kill you. And in a confrontation with evil, the same thing can happen, is that it can be so overpowering and traumatic that it damages your consciousness. And like these things are real. They're real. I mean, that happened to, what's the general's name? The Canadian general who was there during the Rwandan massacre. He developed post-traumatic stress disorder, and he entitled, the book he wrote about the development of his post-traumatic stress disorder was called Shake Hands with the Devil. And that's really what he meant, because he met one of the guys who led the massacre, you know, and anyways, he never really recovered from that. He has post-traumatic stress disorder, and so these things are extraordinarily real. Now, back to the basilisk. Well, if you're going to confront something that's dangerous enough and informative enough to like virtually kill you, and you're going to survive, what does that mean? It means that your capacity for death and renewal is what saves you. And so, you know, you think about this, partly what it means is that, like, there you are, but you learn something. Okay, well, once you learn something, you're not the same as you were before you learned it, right? There's a transformation. So that means you're the same as you are because you're still there, but you're also different. And then you might also ask yourself, well, what do you give up when you learn something? And that's an interesting question, because you very seldom learn something that's completely without precedent. Now, if you do, that's really shocking generally, but you generally don't. What happens is that you already have a framework of evaluation that you're using to interpret the world. And it's good enough to get you from place to place, but it's not 100% accurate. And when you encounter something you didn't expect, or something that's frightening, so that you have to transform your knowledge, generally what happens is you have to lose some of what you already presume before you can learn something new. You know, it's like a prejudice or an oversimplification or an element of your ignorance has to be allowed to die before you can incorporate the information and then grow. And so you might say, well, death is the precondition for learning, at least symbolically speaking, and that's exactly what the phoenix is attempting to represent in the Harry Potter story. Now, who owns the phoenix? Dumbledore, right? And he's sort of god of Hogwarts, so to speak, you know. So the phoenix stands in the same relationship to Dumbledore that Christ stands in relationship to God the Father in Christianity. It's exactly the same kind of idea. Well, it's not exactly the same, obviously, but the underlying structure of the idea is very similar. And if you remember, maybe, what happens to Harry Potter at the very end of the series? What process does he have to go through? He dies, right? And then he comes back to life, right? And he has to die and come back to life in order to defeat evil. It's pretty funny because, you know, a lot of people, especially fundamentalists in the US, were all over Harry Potter for its hypothetically anti-Christian occultism, but, you know, the fundamental story, I wouldn't say it's Christian exactly, because it's actually older than Christianity itself. But the main themes in Harry Potter are, like, Christian symbolism informs the main themes to a great degree. You know, and it's funny because most of the time when you go see this sort of thing, how many of you watched all the Harry Potter movies? Yeah, like what the hell's up with that, you know? This woman got people reading 700-page books when they were 10 years old. I suspect a lot of you were those people. You know, so why were you so interested in that stuff? For God's sake, it's about a magic orphan. What's wrong with you people, you know? Magic orphans? You know, but for some reason, why an orphan? Well, Superman's an orphan too. And if you go on Wikipedia, it's kind of an interesting thing to do. Look up superhero orphans. It's like 500 of them. You know, and that's a very it also goes along with the idea of having two sets of parents, which is also characteristic both of Superman and of Harry Potter, right? Because Harry has his day-to-day, you know, parents that aren't his real parents, and then he has his heavenly parents who are his magic parents. And, you know, this representation here that I've got up in front of you, and I was telling you a little bit about that in the last lecture, you could say in some sense those are representations of your magic parents. And so you can think about it this way. It's like you have a mother and a father, and those are your local mothers and fathers. And whether or not you get along with them, or whether or not they were any good for you, or whether you understand them, or anything like that, in some sense is irrelevant, because they're not your real parents. Your real parents are something more like nature, biology, the unknown, something like that, and culture. We kind of think of that as nature and nurture, you know, which is also a symbolic idea. And so one of the things that Freud thought you couldn't be a man until your father died. It's kind of an interesting idea. And Jung said, yeah, but the death could be symbolic. And partly what he meant by that was that, you know, insofar as you're still the son of your father, or the daughter of your father, or the son of your mother, or the daughter of your mother, you still haven't grown up. You haven't taken the projections, those would be Freudian projections, that make you subordinate to your parents, because you might ask yourself, why the hell do you care what your parents think? You don't care what any random set of 50, 60-year-old people think about you. Why do you care what your parents think? Well, the reason for that, I would say, is because you're suffering or benefiting as a consequence of a projection. You project something onto your parents. It's like a quasi-deity status, and they're the people who know what's going on, and they're entitled to evaluate you, and maybe you're working to achieve things to impress them and make them happy. It's like, well, why them? Why them? You don't care what your parents' friends think, I don't imagine. You probably don't really care what the parents of your friends think. So why do you care what your parents think? Well, understanding that is part of coming to understand the dynamics, Freud would say, of the personal unconscious, because your relationship with your parents is part of your personal unconscious. And Jung's idea was, well, you have to replace... It's interesting, because Freud thought that the reason there were patriarchal religions was because people projected the figure of their father onto the cosmos in some sense. They sort of personified the cosmos. You know, it's like God is an old man with a beard, which, by the way, isn't as stupid a theory as it sounds like. But anyways, so, you know, Freud thought that religion sort of emerged out of the familial dynamic. But Jung thought that that wasn't exactly right, because the religious symbols, like, say, the one on the right there, where you have God the Father, was representing something like a meta-father, you know, the sum total of all fathers, which would be something like the patriarchy. And you need a representation of that, because you are a child of culture. And if you're not a child of culture, then you're an incomplete being. And you also don't want to confuse your parents, or your father, let's say. I mean, there's masculine and feminine elements in both parents, but for the sake of simplification, I'm going to lay it out the way I am laying it out. You don't want to confuse your father with culture or history. He's the embodiment of both those things, but he certainly doesn't embody it in total. And your primary relationship, in some sense, your personal relationship is to your father, but your primary existential relationship is actually to culture itself.